to transform politics. Tonight we're joined by a wonderful panel of speakers, including the 2 directors from the Compassion in Politics think tank and authors from their new book, including Mark Maslin, Pragna Patel, and Anthony Grayling. First, I'm going to pass on to Jennifer Nadell, who's one of the directors of the Compassion in Politics think tank.
Thank you so much, Gemma, and it really is a delight to be with you to talk about what compassion can do. The first thing I want to say about compassion is that I have a vested interest in the subject, because I wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for compassion. My father was a schoolboy in Vienna at the time of Hitler's rise, and he fled on the Kindertransport, a train that was organised by volunteers in the UK and carried 10,000 children to safety during the Second World War. And my father was one of those children, so I wouldn't exist if compassion hadn't existed and got him on that train and got strangers to take him in. He arrived in this country, he knew no one, he barely spoke English, and he was taken in by strangers who gave him an education, who gave him a home, and he went on to have a happy and fulfilling life. And I was one of the things he did while he was alive. He had me. So what I have noticed, and the reason why Compassion in Politics exists, is that up until the 1980s, there was a general consensus in the post-war era that we needed to look after people from the cradle to the grave, that we were all equal, that people should live with their without having to have fear that their basic needs would not be met. The welfare state was founded in the wake of the Second World War, and everyone agreed council housing was a great thing, free education, free healthcare. Then from the early 1980s onwards, we saw a different approach, which was one of rugged individualism, of competitive self-interest, which saw those who failed blamed for failing and cast as malingerers or scroungers, and those who succeeded and made extraordinary sums of money, not as lucky or fortunate, but as people who were deserving of huge, enormous sums of wealth. And that's not to say that there wasn't huge talent involved in that, sometimes, possibly, often, but we changed our value system really as a society, and wealth and celebrity status took over from a much more collective we-based approach to life. It became a me-based approach to life. And so I think if my father was alive today as a child, he wouldn't have made it to this country. He wouldn't have survived, and I wouldn't have survived. I see those pictures of refugees drowning at sea or risking their lives in high waters to get here, and my heart breaks. And we now are on the edge of a famine in Afghanistan, a man or a human-made famine. So what can we do about it? Well, we think there are 2 things that compassion can do. The first thing is that we can introduce compassion into the legislation and the laws that we pass and the policies that we implement. What do we mean by compassion? We mean an empathetic concern for the well-being of another, coupled with action. So compassion says we are all equal. Wherever we live, whatever we do, whatever our sexuality, whatever the colour of our skin, everyone has equal worth. And as a society, we need to recognise that by, at the very least, ensuring that everyone has their basic needs met. And that's not happening in this country at the moment. We have 2 million people relying on food banks. We have infant mortality that, instead of getting better, is getting worse, or at least stalled. We have homelessness on a scale that was unimaginable. We have child poverty on a scale that was unimaginable. And that's while we are the 6th richest nation on earth. So we have lost compassion. So we argue that politicians need to put compassion back at the centre of the laws that they pass. What do we mean by that? We mean that we shouldn't pass a law unless it can be shown that it's not going to inflict harm on the most vulnerable members of society. Recently, we have seen laws passed that push those who are already at the very edge, hanging on, further into poverty, into destitution. And it was known that those laws would have that impact, and yet no one stopped them. So we would like to see a measure introduced that meant that all laws had to clear that basic hurdle of not making those in the most vulnerable circumstances worse off before they can be passed, before the law can be passed. The second thing is that we think the way we do politics desperately needs to be reformed. We live in an anachronistic, paternalistic system where misogyny is hidden behind tradition. You know, the way we conduct Prime Minister's question times, debates on the floor of the House, they're conducted 2 sword lengths apart, with beer, with booze and jeers and shouting and things that would never be allowed in any other place of work. People are allowed to tell lies and there is no comeback. If I was selling you a car and I lied about the nature, the make of the car, or what sort of state it was in, you would be able to go to the law if I had lied. If I'm a politician, I can tell you whatever I want and there will be no comeback, even if it's not true. And as we know, the more we repeat a lie, even if it's countered, the lie begins to stick, particularly with social media. So we would like to see the way we debate change. We would like to introduce a law that would prevent dishonesty in politics in the same way as it's prevented in other areas. And we would also like to see reform of the whipping system. We've seen last week this terrible situation where a 3-line whip was put on members of the Conservative Party to go against their own consciences, to let a fellow member of their party off the hook when he'd been found guilty of misconduct. I mean, how can that be right? That politicians can be obliged to do something that's fundamentally dishonest and certainly immoral. But at the moment we have a system, and the very word whipping tells you all you need to know about it, where members of parliament can be threatened, cajoled and bullied into voting against their conscience, and that needs to change. Anyway, I know I'm running out of time, but what the pandemic showed us is that we do have compassion at our hearts. We saw such extraordinary acts of courage, bravery, community warmth, love, concern for strangers. And that is who we are as humans. And we cannot allow ourselves to be divorced from that compassionate centre that we all have, and to allow politics to be conducted as if compassion didn't exist. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. It was great to hear from you, your historical perspective on how we'd abandon compassion in the approach of this rugged individualism, and how that even the place we make the laws are themselves can be an environment in which compassion is abandoned. So thank you. Next we move on to Professor A.C. Grayling.
Thanks so much, Gemma. Thank you. And Jennifer has outlined with great clarity and eloquence there exactly the central point of compassion in politics, and mentioned some practical things that could be done right now without having to achieve structural change in our political and constitutional order. Things like making lying in Parliament out of the question, auditing all legislation so that the least advantaged in our society are not further damaged by it. Those sorts of moves are practical, they can be done, even with the way things are at the moment. But there is a somewhat longer term thing that we need to take into account too, and that is what has happened to our political order. We're meant to be a democracy. You may remember back in the autumn of 1863, famous speech at Gettysburg Cemetery by Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, where he defined democracy as government of the people, by the people, for the people, which is a very, very fine sounding and good definition, except that the word people in that definition meant different things in different parts of it. So government of the people, that's of everybody. By the people, well, that meant white men who owned property because they were the only ones who had a vote. And then the third occurrence of people is again, all the people. What has happened with our democracies is that politics has crept more and more and more into government. where it doesn't really belong. Politics belongs on the hustings, in the newspapers, in public conversations, in discussions at the restaurant or the pub, where issues of social concern, the question of what direction policy should travel in, all that is very, very important. And there are lots of different opinions and views. People bring their experience of life, of work to these conversations. And it's a very good thing that there should be a robust discussion about it. And it's very, very important indeed that people should be free to express their opinions about these things. But the political process itself, the way it's structured, should be such that when a legislature is convened, it should truly represent the diversity of preferences and opinions that there are in a society. We should have a proportional system of representation, because in that way, you're much more likely to get situations in which governments are formed out of more than one party, and therefore more than one opinion is being translated into policy and into action in government. I want to remind people that in the first past the post system that we have here in the UK, which they use in the US for the House of Representatives, which they have in Canada and India, it's a very, very divisive way of forming governments, because you have two main parties competing with one another to get their hands on the levers of power, and then the winner takes all the power. So if you get a majority in Parliament, then you've got 100% of the power in the country. And even though as a government, you ought to be acting in the interests of everybody, there is always going to be an inclination to act more in the interests of those who've supported you and who might support you again. If you go back to the Federalist Papers, read number 10, Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison, in which he points out all the dangers of factionalism, of party politics. This is why systems which have coalition governments, which have proportional representation, are much more moderate, much more reflective of that diversity of opinion and preference in society. In our own country here, you will remember just very recently, between the election of Theresa May's 2017 government and Boris Johnson's 2019 government, we had a hung parliament. And that was a very good thing, because every single measure that the executive brought forward to the House of Commons had to stand or fall on its merits in the House of Commons, and debates there mattered. The legislature genuinely held the executive to account, which is how things should be. Jennifer mentioned the whipping system. Well, we may all think that MPs need a jolly good whipping, but in fact, the point of their being blackmailed and dragooned and bullied into voting a party line, making them representatives, not of their constituents or of the interests of the country, but of a party political platform, is a bad thing. And it skews the way that decisions are made. And what it comes down to in the end, and this is the key point, the central point, is that government starts to be about statistics, not about people. It becomes about statistics because the party wants to be re-elected and to hold on to power, has got to deliver for its supporters, and it has to deliver for just enough of a majority to give itself a chance of winning the next time round. So instead of putting people at the very heart of what it does, instead of thinking of the impact of legislation, of policy, on the lives of people who lose their jobs, or of people who are disadvantaged in society and find it a struggle to make their way, instead of thinking about the needs of a society in the way of healthcare and education to level up the playing field a bit so people have a better chance of making their way in life, instead of thinking about individuals and the impact on individual lives, politicians in government tend to think about numbers, about statistics, and think about what will benefit enough of a majority, or at least a big enough minority for them to hang on to power. And that is not how it should be. Again, end on this point, Jennifer makes very, very eloquently and poignantly the point about her father, one of the Kindertransport. That's a marvelous moment in our own history here, where we reached out and helped thousands of people who were in mortal danger. Look how different things are at the moment. Look at these awful policies being put forward by the current government on refugees, forgetting entirely the fact that refugees are people who are escaping places of conflict and hunger and poverty and danger, who want to protect their children, their families, who want a chance of a better life. They're pushed away from places of danger and conflict and drawn towards places where they believe there are opportunities and where there is safety. Think about the experience of an individual risking his or her life and the life of their children to try to get away from a dangerous and difficult situation to somewhere where there is more of an opportunity for a flourishing life. And then think of what is involved in turning them away, denying them, refusing them the comfort and the succor that they seek. This is so against the deepest springs of our human sympathy when we walk past somebody in the street who is genuinely suffering. If you see somebody fall in the street and they've hurt themselves badly and you can see that they have, would you walk by? I think anybody who did should really condemn themselves as they would be by others. And yet that is what we do with refugees all the time. And by extension, it's what we do to our own in society when we neglect the interests, the sufferings, the needs, the ambitions of people who get swallowed up in the numbers and are not considered worth helping by a government which is made up of a political party that wants to be re-elected. Statistics instead of people. And Compassion in Politics wants to change that.
Thank you very much. It was great to hear about how the electoral system can also lead to less compassion in politics and a more adversarial approach, and lead politicians to focus too much on numbers, and for your motive point at the end, that we should be more considerate and more compassionate to refugees. Thank you. Next, can I pass on to Pragna Patel, please?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm really delighted and honoured to be here and to join this illustrious panel. I think there isn't a more urgent time to reconfigure our political culture to actually counter what is a truly tumultuous times that we live in. What strikes me in particular is that the events across the world, actually, not just the UK, show that there is a darker, more sinister politics of hatred, intolerance, and violence at play. And it is growing and becoming normalized. It is a politics propelled by the fear of the other and threatens to become the dominant mode by which we relate to one another. And governments around the world have themselves become complicit, if not the drivers, of the onslaught that we see on secular democratic values that were established in the aftermath of the Second World War. We have seen the global rise of the far right and of the religious right in the form of religious fundamentalism and extremism. And we've witnessed the rise of state authoritarianism, anti-immigration hostility, racism, the destruction of the environment, and the triumph of neoliberalism. So much so that around the world, those who dare to speak out for freedom, for equality and justice are not only vilified, but are also no longer safe. So for me, important as compassion is, as a foundational value of civic life, it is meaningless if it is not harnessed to the struggle against the unequal allocation of power and the abuse of power in our families, in our communities, and in state structures, without which we cannot hope to ensure that the moral arc of the universe, as Martin Luther King put it, bends towards justice. In the time that I have, I can only highlight two key challenges that we at Southall Black Sisters have faced in our attempt to build a more inclusive, progressive politics based on the ethics of care and compassion, equality and respect for human rights, a politics that leaves no one behind. My work involves working with some of the most powerless subgroups in society, Black and minority women whose daily struggles for freedom, autonomy and justice in the face of gender-based abuse and related matters such as mental health, destitution and trauma take place in a context of profound powerlessness generated by race, class and sex inequality. For instance, on a daily basis, these women have to contend with increasingly hostile politics towards migrants as Anthony and Jennifer have alluded to. In 2020, the present Home Secretary promised that she would preside over a fair, in quotes, a fair, humane, compassionate, and outward-looking people-first approach to immigration. It was a promise that came out of the scathing Windrush Lessons Learned review. However, no sooner was the review out than she wasted no time in rebranding the hostile environment into a compliant immigration environment, which actually continues to amplify a compassionless, dystopian them and us vision of nationhood and belonging, built on anti-immigration and anti-asylum rhetoric, a rhetoric that cuts through convivial civic spaces and foments hostility and violence against migrants and those who defend them. One example is the current Nationalities Borders Bill, which represents the most vicious attack on the rights of asylum seekers and those who defend them that we have seen yet. At least 60% of the women that we work with have been abused and have insecure immigration status. Some of these women are dependent on their partners or spouses for their immigration status, whilst others arrive in the UK through other immigration routes. However, many of these women are too scared to report their experiences of abuse because of their insecure immigration status and the no recourse to public funds condition, which is a central pillar of the hostile environment policy, and it prohibits access to the welfare safety net. As a consequence, many of these women are forced into economic dependency on their abusive partners who use their lack of status as a weapon of control and coercion. If women manage to exit abusive relationships because of the no recourse to public funds condition, they become destitute and find themselves unable to access shelters or safe alternative accommodation or welfare benefits, without which they cannot survive. Left homeless and penniless, and they are often forced to find other means of survival that are full of immense risks and dangers, or they're forced to reconcile with abusive partners. The hostile environment policy has also led to the spreading out of border controls to key institutions of the state, including hospitals, workplaces, universities, the police, and social services. The latter, for example, often prioritize their duty to report abused migrant women or their violent perpetrators to immigration enforcement, rather than offer immediate protection or hold perpetrators to account using the civil or criminal justice systems. It is an approach that compromises their duty of care based on equality and humanitarian principles. The febrile political and economic environment that we inhabit also has serious implications for the nature of political culture in other ways. We also have to contend with the growth in religious right politics in the UK that has been influenced by resurgent and increasingly transnational nature of Islamist politics. But this phenomenon is also mirrored in Hindu and Sikh diaspora populations that are similarly influenced by and connected to the resurgence of Hindu and Sikh fundamentalism and ultranationalist and supremacist movements in the Indian subcontinent that have unleashed hatred and vigilante violence against Muslims and other minorities. Like the far right, the religious right too seeks to subvert the ideas of tolerance, compassion, and justice by closing down democratic spaces for debate and resistance, precisely because these spaces are conducive to the formation of solidarity based on values of shared humanity. This authoritarian turn towards fundamentalist and conservative religious politics has led to the normalization of a culture of blasphemy, hurt sentiment, and intolerance that results in enforced silence and censorship. From the 1990s onwards, for instance, we have witnessed with alarming frequency attempts by the Muslims, Christian, Hindu, and Sikh religious right to clamp down on non-conformity and impose a strict religious identity on followers, if necessary, by force and intimidation. It has also led to the growing accommodation of a narrow fundamentalist and conservative definition of religious identity within public bodies, what I call multi-faithism, which has fostered an environment that is conducive to new configurations of masculinity and patriarchal control that also radiates violence and fear. And this becomes the means by which to subjugate women and sustain patriarchal structures. The impact of all of this is, of course, to impede women's rights to justice and to treat them as less equal before the law. In conclusion, what I want to highlight is that these overlapping processes of illiberalism have created a toxic political discourse that seeks to diminish, if not destroy, the very values of compassion, tolerance, cultural syncretism, justice, and equality that we have struggled to create and now defend. That is why I argue that the push for more compassion in politics is meaningless unless it is also linked to an inclusive agenda for equality and social justice. And to end, I would say that we should pay attention to the countless courageous struggles for social justice waged in the past and in the present by ordinary women and other marginalized groups around the world. What their resistance tells us is that in the midst of one of the bleakest moments of our history, spaces of kindness, courage, resistance, and solidarity are possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an emotive and compelling argument. I certainly found it particularly emotive to hear about the role of the religious right and the hostile environment policies, and how this is acted to diminish compassion in politics, and really how compassion needs to be dealt with alongside equality and inclusive agenda. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can I pass on to Mark, please?
Certainly. So I'm sitting here at COP26 in Glasgow, and I've been here for the whole week. And I think what's really interesting is that in many parts of our politics, we are missing compassion and passion, but not here. I have been on the protests on the Friday and the Saturday. The range of people on those protests are amazing. There is huge compassion for our planet. Sorry. You also find that that's also in the negotiations as well. You can find that actually there are the NGOs that are passionate and pushing compassion. You hear the young people's voices there echoing. But why? Why is that compassion for our planet? Well, I think it's because they step back, and us, sometimes cold scientists, have been giving them facts that have suddenly woken them up. I'll give you an idea of the state of the planet. We move more soil, sediment, and rock than all the natural processes put together. We have made enough cement to cover the whole world in a layer 2 millimeters thick, and that includes the oceans. We make 300 million tons of plastic every single year. And actually, it ends up in our oceans. And there's this incredible discovery of a plastic bag in the bottom of the Marianas Trench, 7 kilometers deep in the Northwest Pacific. The only problem was it didn't have Walmart or Marks and Spencer's on it, because that would have been a PR disaster. Unfortunately, it was just a white plastic bag. Again, other facts. Did you know that there are more Lego minifigures in the world than real people? And there's 7.9 billion people. So that's a lot of Lego. Actually, I think most of them are probably in my house at home in London. So we've cut down half the trees. Okay, we've cut down 3 trillion trees. There's only 3 trillion trees left. And the fact that really, how I think really forces it home is when I talk about the weight of mammals on land. Okay, if you take them and you're a scientist, you weigh them all, 30% is humans. There's 7.9 billion of us. We weigh quite a lot. 67% is our livestock and our pets. Just 3% of mammals on land are all those wonderful things that David Attenborough goes around filming so we can watch it on a Sunday evening to have that enjoyment of our beautiful natural world. That's how much we've changed the whole world. And you wonder why young people have eco-anxiety and have this real deep compassion for the planet. Well, that's just the planet. What about the state of humanity? 7 million children still die needlessly every single year of preventable diseases or starvation. 820 million people go to bed feeling hungry every night. That has gone up in the last 5 years by about 25 million. But we have enough food to feed 10 billion people. 1 billion people still do not have regular, safe access to safe, clean drinking water. That's why people can see the compassion that's required when we're looking at developing and trying to lift people out of poverty. And then if we look at the climate, and this is why Glasgow is here, we've already warmed the planet by 1.1 degrees Celsius, and we can see the effects all around the world. Extreme heat waves, droughts, floods, sea level rise, wildfires. And we know in every single case, it is the vulnerable, it is the poor that are most affected by these events. Looking forward, one of my greatest fears with climate change is the ability for people to work outside. So as temperatures and humidity go up, suddenly the small farmers who feed half the planet will start to lose days because it's physiologically impossible to work outside. And this is something that we're working with the medics, we're really concerned about, because big companies and countries don't think about where the food is being produced. But things are a-changing. I think somebody famous said that in a song. And the key thing is it's because of that compassion. I have to say, one of the things that invigorates me every single day is the next generation. Their compassion for our planet, their compassion for humanity, and their passion to deal with climate change. So every aspect of our economy is waking up to climate change and sustainability. You have huge companies who have suddenly realized that they have to change the way they operate. You have governments starting to make huge announcements. In COP, this COP has lots of little announcements. The reason being is we don't need a big one. That was Paris. What we need is lots of little pragmatic steps all the way through. People are also talking about it more and more. I cannot remember a COP or any meeting that has had so much media attention from around the world. Suddenly that dialogue, normal people are actually able to talk about it, and that releases some of that anxiety, but it also allows them to build compassion for our planet and our environment. And action is happening, as I said. A couple of years ago, you would never have heard the word net zero. The idea that 197 countries have agreed to actually reduce all emissions to net zero by the middle of the century would have been unheard of. Now, whether it happens or not is another matter, but it's really interesting that the geopolitics means it is really difficult for any country to deny that that's the pathway they should be on. And I will emphasize this again. Underlying this is compassion. And I would say, I don't care about the politics. The atmosphere does not care what badge you wear, whether it happens to be right, middle, or left. We all know that there are policies that work on either side of the spectrum that can be applied to looking after the environment and people. The atmosphere doesn't care where the actual pollution comes from. All it cares about is by how much. And so therefore, I think we're in a new era, particularly with the new generation coming through, of compassion. Compassion for our planet, compassion for biodiversity, compassion for ecology, and even passion for people. And for me, the thing that makes me think that we are going into a better world, and I have to say, I pick up on Anthony, Pragner's, and Jennifer's comments, we are in a very bad state. is actually the next generation seems to think very differently to us. And I'm hoping that we are on an upward trend towards more compassionate politics.
Thank you very much. It's interesting to hear about compassion as a way to deal with the climate change. It's an approach I've not particularly heard before. Usually the scientific approach is more mainstream in the media. You're not so convinced.
Have you not heard scientists speak? I mean, the interesting thing is, I would agree with you 10 years ago, is these are the facts, etc. But if you look at them, I mean, we've had scientists here who have been arrested on the protests and have been shipped off for a night in the cells and then released in the morning. So there is a really different view. I think science has evolved from being, we can just tell the facts and it's up to everybody else, to people actually realizing that they're real people at the same time and can be compassionate and passionate about the science. And I think it also is a way of pushing back against the climate change deniers, the fossil fuel lobbyists, because when you speak from the heart, the public actually goes, yeah, I understand where he's coming from.
Thank you. Yeah. I think science in itself is a compassionate subject. It's done with compassionate intent. I'm going to post a link to the book in the chat now for anyone who wishes to buy the new book. I think that's gone through. But I really do recommend that you buy it if you're interested in what these speakers have to say here. Today's event, a more comprehensive version of their approach will be in the new book. I'm not sure if anyone wants to speak more on the book briefly.
I'll just say something that I think one of the legacies of the patriarchal way knowledge has been stored is it has been put in different compartments. And I say this as someone who trained to become a barrister, and I was encouraged not to become emotionally involved with my subjects lest that cloud my judgment. And the same is said to medical students, or was said to medical students. But we can no longer compartmentalize knowledge. We can no longer keep the books in their separate sections on the library shelves, because actually everything is interconnected. And what this book is trying to do is it's brought together leading thinkers, as you've heard this evening, in every field, because they're all connected. We can't look at one subject without also looking at the rest. And compassion as a concept, as a value, as a campaigning tool exists in every single area of study and human endeavour.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I hope this interdisciplinary approach is picked up on by politicians when addressing modern day problems. So we're now open to have any questions. If anyone has any questions, please can you just message them in the chat, or just turn your microphone off and ask any questions. Please put your hand up first so that it's somewhat of an order. So we have a question from Luke for Jennifer, who asks, you argued that poor etiquette, lying, and the Patterson scandal are examples of how Parliament is paternalistic. How specifically are these gender-based issues?
Well, I think it's about power. You know, Pragna was very clear in what she said so powerfully, that this is about the abuse of power. And power was traditionally held by men and still largely is. And that means that things are ordered to shore up those who have power, those who are men. So I think that men suffer from the patriarchy, not as harshly as women, but I don't think the patriarchy serves any living person of whatever gender. So to that extent, it's not gender based, but it certainly is. It was based around a male system. It was based around the notion of conflict. It's based around winning and losing. It's based around a very binary system that doesn't take into consideration cooperation, lack of competitiveness, collaboration. So I think that gender is in there.
Thank you very much. Please do ask more questions in the chat. In the meantime, I'll ask one of my own questions. So I was wondering, this compassionate approach to politics, do you think it should be implemented top down by politicians, or do you think it should be pushed for by the people and then they will respond to this change?
Shall I go first, Gemma?
Yeah, of course.
I think it has to be both. I think that first of all, we have to pay attention to grassroots organization struggles, whether it's against climate change around the world, whether it's against poverty, whether it's against injustice of other kinds, social, economic, political. These struggles are really, really important. And at that local level, what they do when they are made visible, and the media have a huge responsibility in making these struggles visible as well. But what they do when there are these protests against all forms of inequality and injustice is that they actually, in the process, try to reconfigure a wider civic culture that's based on values that we should all care deeply about. So for me, one of the most heartening things I saw, I think it was earlier this year in Glasgow, when two men were about to be removed by immigration enforcement officers. I don't know how many people will remember this, but they were about to be removed by, sort of officers carrying out an immigration raid. And suddenly the whole neighborhood erupted, and young people and neighbors came together and said, hands off, you will not do this. These are our neighbors. These are people of our community. This is touching them is touching us, And I think that episodes like that, protests like that, tell us something about how people want to live their lives and the values that they want to live by. I also think it is top down in the sense that politicians have to show leadership, and they have to show leadership against popular currents that are, conservative or far right currents. At the moment, what we see is popular politicians, relying on their vote banks, doing things to shore up their vote banks, remaining populist because that's how they think they should go. And instead of showing leadership, actually do the opposite, and too scared, too frightened to stand up to things that we should no longer tolerate, censorship, a culture of intimidation and violence that encourages, militias and vigilante groups to go out and do what they like with people that they assume are that they deem to be the other, whether that's racist or whether that's patriarchal violence or whatever it is. So I think that there are very few politicians that we could count on who will provide leadership, who will go against that current and say we have to stand up for things that we believe in. And here I'm thinking particularly about the murder of Jo Cox, the MP, who was murdered by a white supremacist who was threatened by her support for refugees, by her support for immigrants, but there are very few of those MPs. So I think that it is the more we see of protests and understand the resistance that is being waged by ordinary powerless people, the more it should embolden us to do the same and to provide solidarity and the space to tell those stories. And that could also in turn shame politicians to stop being so populist and start thinking about the values that they stand for. So I think that, the processes both ways.
Thank you very much. I do remember feeling like my trust in humanity was restored after watching that video, and I hope more people do come forward and stand up for what they believe in and what is right, and politicians do the same. So thank you. Does anyone else wish to answer that question? Otherwise, we'll move on to Joe's question. No? Okay, Joe, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like sometimes, like maybe in certain circumstances, like obviously letting in refugees here is a compassionate thing, but sometimes it can have very negative consequences on the countries that these people have left. Like, for example, I know the Nayib Bukele, the leader of El Salvador, stated that kind of how, and Gambia's leader, whose name escapes me as well, spoken and said how the brain drain and how this kind of, it might be compassionate here, but it actually negatively affects millions of people back at home. How do you reconcile, maybe sometimes it might be compassionate by an individual circumstances, but it actually could be have very, very negative, it might have negative consequences for other countries. I know the same is in Central Asia as well, with Uzbekistan, kind of lots of the intelligence here kind of migrate to Russia and things like that. So yeah, well, yeah, but wasn't, or yeah, okay.
So I'm happy to take that one, because you're talking about more economic migrants. And I think that many countries recognize this as an issue. But what they do in many of them is they put in ways of actually bringing people home. So what they do is they actually will put up fellowships, they'll put up some support for their people, the best of the best, to go to particular countries, to be trained, to then actually take all that knowledge and then bring it back. What was really interesting is 10 years ago, China set up a bring them home policy. And dear friends of mine in the sciences were given brand new labs and professorships, probably maybe 5 or 10 years earlier than they would have done in the UK or America. And what they did was just invest. So I think you can use that in both ways. I think, but it is very different to what Pragma and others are talking about, which is then the refugee crisis, where you have people of any sort of like background who are forced to leave because of the atrocities at their home.
I just want to come back and say that actually, I think there's a false division between economic migrants and refugees. I really think that many economic migrants are fleeing displacement precisely because of climate change and the way in which, you know, livelihoods are being lost in rural areas, and deforestation that's going on, and so on and so forth, in many of the countries of the global south. So I think, first of all, I never want to play into what politicians do about people migrating, which is, you know, there are deserving and undeserving, and economic migrants are problematic, but, you know, genuine, so-called genuine refugees are, you know, are to be welcomed, although in limited numbers. So I think that's the first problem. The second thing is that if we want to stop the brain drain, the way to do it is to equalize the trading relationships that exist, the sheer inequality of power and resources, you know, that lie with the West and not the global South. And the way in which colonialism, understanding the impact of colonialism in terms of the looting of resources and the, you know, ravishing of countries and their lands and so on, and people, exploitation of people, the expropriation of resources. These are all, and these are continuing in different ways. We no longer have colonialism, but we have it through economic agreements that are hugely imbalanced, do not, you know, respect the poor in the global South, do not respect the idea of sustainability and livelihoods on a small level, you know, link up with multinationals to effectively, you know, play the land grab game, the resources grabbing game, without reference to labor rights, without reference to any other kind of rights, including the rights of those who live off the land. So I think that, you know, I think that this is why compassion on its own cannot achieve what we need to achieve. And it is about joining up the dots. Climate justice for me is also migrant justice. If we can do the things that you've talked about in relation to climate justice, we may also impact on the way migration works and moves, you know, from where people are displaced to where they can try and achieve a better future for themselves. So I think these are all linked. These are all linked problems, massive problems to be resolved. But at the heart of it has to be, what are our values? What are the values by which we want to reorder our society and the culture that we want to foster? And it's about joining up all these kinds of dots around, you know, climate justice, migrant justice, for me is labor justice, it's women's justice, it's all of these things, and they all matter. And at the heart of all of that is the need for compassion, but it's more than just that.
There's an interesting paradox implied in Joe's question, and that is that rich countries, you know, give help to the better qualified, the more expert people who want to migrate. You know, we have a migration policy here which is attractive to engineers and scientists and doctors, and we turn away the people who are fleeing from conflict and from hunger and disaster. So, you know, we are encouraging a brain drain from places where those brains are needed, and we're turning back people who are fleeing. And they come from different parts of the world. I mean, you know, Canada for a long time has had a policy of attracting people who've got money, who've got educational qualifications and so on. Just very quickly on an earlier point, you know, in our political culture, we mainly, most people passively wait to hear what the parties will deign to offer us in the way of a manifesto. They're going to tell us what policies they offer us, and then we've got two choices really. You know, we've got bad or worse. And what we should be doing is we should be demanding of our politicians and of the political parties that they sit up and take notice of some of the really pressing issues. Some of those mentioned in the discussion this evening. But in order to encourage people to participate more, and I go back to the point that I was making about our political system here, you know, in a voting system such as we have, the majority of votes cast in a general election mean nothing at all. They have no effect because governments are elected on minorities. And if you vote for a losing candidate, your vote is completely useless. In fact, the even worse paradox is that if you don't vote at all, you actually help the person who wins, if you look at the maths of it. But this means people get turned off. They don't feel that they're going to make a difference. And so a lot of people don't vote at all, or they vote in a very desultory way, or don't pay enough attention to what's being offered us by the parties. If our votes mattered more, we would be more participatory, and then we would stop being passive, and we would start to ask our politicians, and in particular our governments, to behave better in all the respects we would like them to.
Well, I think it's also that we have been sold this myth that we are utterly powerless. There is a huge power imbalance, but we have the capacity to change things in our communities, in our neighbourhoods. You know, that incident that Pragna referred to, where the community stopped the deportation, you know, it's down to all of us. In the absence of the voting system that Anthony is talking about, which we do so desperately need, a voting system in which every vote matters, we can take action, we can make a difference, we can have an impact. We don't need to stay in that passive waiting space or give up hope, because something is always available for us to do.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all speaking on that point. Thank you. Any final questions before we bring the event to a close? It's your last chance. So just feel free to unmute if you have any further questions. In that case, then I think we'll finish the event. Thank you to all the amazing speakers for joining us. It was really great to hear from you all. We'll be posting the book on all our social media accounts after this event. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you at some more events in the future, to all new faces.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Gemma. All the best.
Thank you so much, Gemma.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.